Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland and I'm at All Saints Church in Ealing. I'm at this church because it's dedicated to the immortal memory of Spencer Perceval, who was Prime Minister, and it's the only church in the United Kingdom which is dedicated to the memory of a Prime Minister. So Spencer Perceval is unique in another manner in that he's the only Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to date to have been assassinated. We live in hope. Anyway, apart from that, he wouldn't be very well known, didn't leave that much of a mark on history, but all right, his career was cut short after only 3 years in office. So Spencer Perceval, he was from a well-established family in the Midlands. They had considerable estates in Northampton, for example. So he was upper class, certainly, on the edge of the nobility, and he had Spencer as his Christian name, an unusual Christian name, I know, but partly because he was related to the Spencer family, who'd been prominent for centuries in that part of the country. Princess Diana, her maiden name was Spencer. Her father was Earl Spencer. Earl not being a boy's name, but a heritable noble title in this country. And what else? Okay, obviously Winston Churchill, his surname was originally Spencer Churchill, but he later dropped the first part of it, didn't want to be called Spencer Churchill, simply known as Churchill. I think I explained why in another video. So Spencer Perceval, he went to Harrow School, which is only about 5 miles north of here, and he's the first Prime Minister to be an old Harrovian. And he later went to Cambridge, I think it was Trinity, and he was called to the bar. And indeed at Lincoln's Inn, one of the Inns of Court, there's a memorial to him and an inscription in Latin. He's not buried there though. He's buried in Charlton. So he entered Parliament at a young age, didn't practice law very much. He was independently wealthy. Remember, members of Parliament didn't get any salary in those days. So you've got an idea of the size of the place, All Saints Church. He soon began to identify with the Tories, but obviously the 1790s, a lot of people didn't call themselves Tories, called themselves Pittites, as in supporters of Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister, although often they wouldn't actually give themselves a political label. I mean, they would be supporters of the government, because Pittite was originally pejorative. It was the enemies of William Pitt the Younger who dubbed his disciples Pittites. There are plenty of MPs who were not clearly Whigs or Tories or anything. It was anybody's way to guess which they would vote. Obviously, they had to be provided with enough swill in the trough to do things this way or that. Offering douceur was entirely legal at the time in the 18th century into the early 19th century. So he was there at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and he held many cabinet positions. And then indeed 1809 he became First Lord of the Treasury. That's commonly called Prime Minister. Of course, Prime Minister wasn't the official title until the early 20th century. The first time it was actually put in the order of precedence. If they were going to refer to the Prime Minister, any official document, they always said First Lord of the Treasury in those days. The Prime Minister is still First Lord of the Treasury as well as Prime Minister, but obviously he's far more commonly known as Prime Minister. Anyway, so he never wavered in his belief that France must be defeated. The Whig Party, on the other hand, by this stage, into the 1890s, were saying, let's negotiate. There had been 1 year of peace, the Peace of Amiens. Neither side had been really committed to it. There hadn't been much good faith, and war had broken out afresh in 1802. Various coalitions lined up against Napoleonic France. I won't just give you a blow-by-blow account of the Napoleonic Wars, but anyway, so the key to all this was trade, I suppose. Russia joined France's side, not actually fighting, but fairly friendly with them, where they had been enemies of theirs, and Napoleon had defeated them at 2 battles in what's now Poland. Anyway, Napoleon, he met the young impressionable Tsar, Alexander of that name the First, at Tilsit, this lake, sort of on the border of the French-ruled Poland and Russian-ruled Poland, and there was a barge, and actually the Tsar had his tutor and advisor hiding underneath the floorboards to whisper him what to do. And negotiations were conducted in French Alexander Romanov, like all educated European gentlemen, was completely conversant in French. And some of the Russian upper orders spoke French more than they did Russian in those days. If you dip into any Tolstoy novels set at this time, you'll see that they're peppered with French phraseology. And some of these words have just entered the French language, the Russian language, like cher amiki, as in from cher ami, as in someone who's begging from you, calling you cher ami, dear friend. So where did I get to? Anyway, because Russia was pally with the French Empire, Spencer Perceval decreed that trade with Russia be forbidden. Now, a certain struggling businessman, John Bellingham, was then wrecked by this, so he was irate, and he thought the only thing to do was to get himself a gun, very easy to do in those days, no Firearms Act, and go straight to Parliament, find the Prime Minister and shoot him dead. Well, that's going to solve your problem. So he promptly did that, and security was very lax. Remember, the Metropolitan Police didn't even exist. This was 1812. Obviously, and perhaps he left it a bit too late, because this was just about time Russia's about to break that and start trading with the UK. Anyway, and the Napoleon was going to say, well, I can't let the Ruskies get away with that. If they start trading with the British and are seen to go unpunished, then other countries are going to start doing commerce with the British, and the whole thing will fall apart. The continental system, the idea that we don't, that we wreck the United Kingdom by not trading them. They're a nation of shopkeepers. They live by their merchandise. Anyway, so it had waited a few months. Obviously, there was going to be a Russian reversal of policy. But anyway, so Bellingham, he promptly shot him dead, and that was that. And Spencer Perceval died on the spot. Bellingham was apprehended. There were scores of witnesses, and he was put on trial. They didn't mess about in those days. It was very quick, and he was found guilty. Obviously, hundreds of people wanted to attend his trial, and he was hanged only 3 days later. And in public, it was until 1868, all hangings were just outside the prison walls. And so, and the executioner was allowed to keep his clothes. The clothes of the condemned, one of the perquisites of the job, sell them, even sell the rope with which the person was hanged. It was a bit of a celebrity execution, so that's money for old rope. And often he would obviously slice up the rope and sell little segments of it, but often it's said they were often selling ropes which had nothing to do with the hanging. It was money for old rope. They were selling you really these false trinkets. Anyway, that's Bellingham. That was the end of him. It was a slow drop in those days, agonizing 20 minutes dangling on the end of the hemp rope. It was barbaric, but satiated this public lust for suffering and vengeance. His great-great-great-great-grandson, Henry Bellingham, was a Conservative MP for Norfolk Northwest, lost in 1997, re-elected in 2001. That's the King's Lynn area, and I think he's standing down from Parliament now. Thought about being Speaker, but didn't get anywhere. So Spencer Perceval's relatives, they lived around here for decades afterwards, and there's a plaque to him somewhere. A few other buildings associated with him in Ealing that was unveiled by his great-great-great-great-granddaughter not so long ago. He was married, he had children, all the rest of it. He was an Anglican, so this church is a memorial to him on the site of Elm House, where he used to reside. Well, elms, perhaps that's singularly apposite, given that they were used to hang people with their strong lower branches, and of course someone who killed him was hanged. Well, that's probably enough about Spencer Perceval right now. The first, if I've got it correct, 5 Harrovian prime ministers. I was saying about his very distant relative Winston Churchill. He dropped the Spencer bit because the boys had to process past the headmaster in alphabetical order, and he didn't like being so far down that alphabet. Simplicity. Bit more of the common man without a double-barrel surname. On the other hand, Churchill could sometimes be a crashing snob and pull all the strings he could to advantage himself. But that's that. Enough about Spencer Perceval.